And it's an ongoing, uh, it's a very ongoing thing, because once we get into this habit of sharing stories and telling story, it goes on. I would also share some questions that I have always found in my experience to be shaping storytelling in that sense. The first, again, from social sector point of view, one of the questions I have found, that needs deeper answering is, what is the origin story? Why do you exist, and for whom and how? A lot of time, our own stories are not chronicled enough, and I, every time there is an emotional connection, there is a human bond that gets formed. It's because of your own origin story. Why are you at a particular mission, and who are you, where you come from? The second question I've always wondered is how the world that matters to you, sees you, and that's of course perception. And once you figure that out, then it becomes easier to look at stories and look at your narrative mission, and then bring about this change in perception, the way you want to be seen. Community is always a big burning question. Like, is there a community you engage with? Who you go back to regularly? And what do you talk? What's the conversation like? What's the human connection? Without human connection, it's difficult to imagine a story at all. Our emotions of sorrow, pain, joy, all of that become very essential elements in any story. And the other thing is also being clear about what you really want to achieve, and how does it align with your mission, each and every story. Humanizing becomes very, very crucial I've seen in the stories that I have done, and when I watch others who go about it. It is almost like producing a movie. And I was reflecting upon this when I watched this movie, 12th Fail. And, we will all remember another narrative that became production, which was about Kota Factory. Both of them kind of attack a similar problem, but in their own ways. Of course, both of them humanize, but there is a certain element of solution. There's a certain element of constructive path which comes in the 12th fail, and there is a narrative arc of the story which takes it to such a beautiful conclusion that it inspires everyone. And it also is about identifying your key actors of change and impact in your own fields of work. Of course, it cannot be you, at least in the way you are looking to bring about a change in perception and use stories as a tool for change. But I have always found in conversations with social sector organizations, and many of you that I have engaged with, is to have this sense of who is the key actor of change. Showing vulnerabilities is absolutely amazing, because it again is a lot about creating human bonds, being honest. There is nothing more important as an ingredient in stories than being honest, and than showing your own vulnerabilities. There's nothing that works better. There is also a lot of focus on formats. Because others are doing a podcast, or because others are doing something in a certain way, short videos or a podcast, just getting up and thinking of format first, I have found that to be not so helpful. It always helped in some of the great story products I have seen come out, to staying with the story and not thinking of format at all. Because format can be anything. It can be a GIF or audio story podcast, but it's always better to let the story define it. One of the examples when we were discussing about your own origin stories is, the set of questions that I normally ask people when I'm trying to capture their origin story. And I've always felt that your own origin stories are like a great launch pad for you to start your narrative journey. And what you do with it kind of also shapes your connection, your bond with your own communities. So who are you, of course, is a very crucial question. How did you get here is even more important, because there is a backstory to it. And that makes it more believable when you show your own vulnerabilities, failures, learnings. Why do you exist? Do look up, if you would like, Simon Sinek's Why. Of course, it has a lot of enterprise connect, but it is applicable anywhere. What do you do and how? Again, this whole question about how do you explain what you do to your grandma or your 10-year-old daughter? Uh, and finally, where do you go from here? Which is almost like a science fiction view. Uh, a lot of younger people, and by young, I mean people from 14 year and above, I have found them to be very fascinated with this idea of, the science fiction view, a Star Trek view of your work, of your field, your sector, and so on. No, I mean, absolutely, the universe is made of stories, not atoms, and that is what makes it even more interesting. What makes a good story is a very broad question, and it is very contextual, which is why in this session I just want to spend with some broad pointers and time with some broad pointers, and then jump into listening to you all. Overall, I think a structure of a story is very crucial. Um, the the narrative arc of a story, identifying characters of your story, the plot, which involves twists and turns, so people are hooked to it. Anything that you as a consumer get thrilled or excited about, it is no different from your own audiences. I have had a very tough learning with this, because we normally don't think of us as consumers. So what we consume as great content, it's the same thing for others. I mean, there's not much of difference. We love great stories. We love great storytelling. So it's ditto for people who you are targeting. Um, there are more questions when we think of stories. And when you have your own narrative mission, which is aligned with where do you want to go, what do you want the stories to do for you and your own organization, then a lot of these questions come, which is, why should anyone care to know about this? And this anyone is your community. Uh, Sometimes stories can also help seed a new community. So again, this depends on your own aspirations. How will this contribute to your narrative mission once you have identified your narrative mission, and who do you collaborate with? And then you can think of how many stories and so on. So I'll pause here, but I think a few weeks ago I came across this very interesting blog from Shweta, and I was reading it, and then something happened, and I worked upon it to turn it around into a different kind of a story. I'm just looking for that story. In the meantime, please throw all your questions, suggestions, or your own problem statements out there.
Yeah, if you'd like to add anything in the chat, or I think Lakshmi Priya, you had raised your hand and had a question.
Yeah.
You'd all like to add any questions you have till now or anything in the chat, please go ahead. Okay, I think we have 2 questions in the chat. One was from a previous one where Shantanu was asking, what do you mean when you say chronicle?
Yeah.
Um,
So chronicle is an old word for capturing something. Like chronicling is to just capture it, to 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 store it in a way that it can be told or shared.
Another question that's come in is, what have you seen as a common challenge in storytelling in the social sector?
So the biggest common thing I have found is, who are you telling this story to, and why? And I've spent time with some of you and going forward with a lot of you more. And I'm mentioning this as a challenge. I mean, knowing your community and who are you targeting is because it keeps changing. And sometimes it's potential, grant makers. Sometimes it's policy makers. Um, and of course, at times there are people who you want to impact or whose life you want to change. So I have found this as the biggest challenge in terms of, because there is so much that you have in your own notes, in your own Google Drives, and then so many events that get organized, but you don't unlock them. And that frustrates me and also fascinates me because it's such a big opportunity. As a journalist, we would we would we would die to tell those stories. And when I was reading Key Education's story that Shweta wrote about this Anganwadi worker in Chhatarpur, I was getting goosebumps. So everything that a great story demands, you have all of that. Sometimes in your own WhatsApp messages or Google Drives or hard disk drives and so on. So I have found this to be a great challenge across the social sector, unlocking that and helping them travel to stories that you can touch and feel.
More questions coming in. One more question is, how much does physical presence of the storyteller in the vicinity of the stakeholder matter? What are other ways to compensate for this absence?
I didn't really get it. So someone who is telling the story, their presence, is that right?
Yeah, how much does it matter if of the physical presence of the storyteller in the vicinity of the community they're working in?
It matters a lot. And it matters even more in the age of AI. And I think the human crafted, the one thing that AI, at least for now, will find it difficult to recreate is this human sense of bond. And that cannot get formed until you are physically present. So, and ditto for this workshop, when this idea first came up, I was like, okay, can we meet them in person? Even if it means, doing dozen or more meetings one-on-one, I would love to do that. So I think it's very crucial because the warmth that you feel and the bonds that get formed, uh, and there is more believable, sense of belief when you are around. I have also seen that when you go to their field of work, the people whose story you are telling, it is highly appreciated. And you will unlock insights and anecdotes that otherwise you may miss out. So it is a great idea to be there.
And a follow-up to that is, what are the ways to compensate for your absence in the community?
Yeah, we've been through that, right? During pandemic and even now because of our schedules and so on. I would say not to think of stories, uh, but think of conversations, because stories are outcomes of conversations. And there is, if you say, okay, I'm going to talk to someone on these 5 points, you set up a call and you go about it in a very methodical way, there is something there is something very unpredictable about how great stories form. And this is beyond the essential ingredients, which is why making conversation as an agenda and let stories become outcomes or byproduct of that conversation is a better approach. So I would say a good way for making up is to strike a conversation and let stories be byproducts of that conversation.
I think there are a few more questions in the chat. Actually, if Charmi Prakash, you'd like to unmute and ask.
Sure.
Hi, Pankaj.
Hi.
I want to ask you, how do we adapt the art of storytelling to maintain consistency on social media? How can we use that to make our socials more interesting? Because that's what people have time for, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a very practical question. Um, I, I've spent a lot of time looking at what works in so-called social media and what doesn't. I think before that, it also makes sense perhaps to ask a question about, are you seeking noise or are you seeking impact? I've also found them to be different things. Or are you seeking visibility versus are you seeking a community connection? And this broadly takes us to the direction of quality and quantity of audience. Having said that, let me now tackle the specific question that you asked. I feel there is a parallel network on social media that social sector needs to engage with very deeply and curate this parallel media network. These are your individuals. Sometimes these individuals will have just a few thousand followers, but in their life and work, your mission may be one of the focus areas that they care for. It can be anything from gender rights to education and so on. So in your field of work, I think it would be a good starting point if you identify these micro influencers. And I'm not talking about your big Dia Mirza and so on, or Ayush Shraddha. I'm not talking about them. There is this another layer of folks on social media across Instagram and elsewhere who have good 20,000 upward followers and who are more open to engage with you, and at the same time who care for what you care for. So finding that intersection and building this community or a parallel network of micro social media influencers is a good starting point. The second thing about creating social posts and social media posts is also, look, I mean, I don't want to repeat them, but they are all available. Great playbooks, how to create engaging social media design, reels, and so on. Those things are a commodity. I think if you go deeper into the mechanics of what happens after you create a great social post, spending time there, I feel would be more useful, because creating a great social post is a commodity these days. I mean, everybody uses, there's so many tools, and of course there is Canva too. But I think at the end of it, how does it travel, and who does it travel to, and what it does to your cause, to your community? I feel those are better question when it comes to social media posts.
Thank you,
Pankaj,
Pankaj.
one question I had was in terms of when we're writing about our beneficiaries, right? And that's what largely our stories are about, our beneficiaries and how they have benefited. It tends to become repetitive over time.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're dealing with and would like to know how we can maybe look at that differently.
That's a great question. And it's an ongoing challenge, you know. I think there is no straight answers to it, boss. I mean, I'll be very honest. I find I feel what you're saying, because sometimes it starts playing in a loop. If, for example, we are talking about a community of teachers or an Anganwadi worker and so on, I think it can start playing like that song, like a ear loop, right? And it is very painful. So I completely feel you. I think one of the things that has worked for me in breaking the mold is kind of think of another sub community within that domain. So, for example, if it's just the teaching community, can we go towards another sub community which is around there at the periphery? That has helped me. And I feel it also brings a fresh thinking, a fresh face, a kind of breaks this loop in many ways. It has worked for me. And I'm sure it can work. I think identifying those sub communities other actors inside the same larger ecosystem. If none of that, I would say your own origin story, and then telling it, reinforcing why you are doing what you are doing, and not be ashamed of that. I feel, because one of the other things I've noticed in social sector is, by the nature of it, you are all very good people, right? I mean, there is a certain humility, and I feel humility is a burden because it defeats the cause. If your cause is to create impact, you can be humble in so many other ways. But when it comes to telling stories, there's no need to be humble. So I feel, tell your own stories, find sub communities in your field of work, break the mold. Um, there is no other answer to it. I would just pick up my bag and run around and find someone until I find someone. Um, Also, the thing about routine is, it is routine because sometimes I have also felt that the same story, when they travel to a different community, it kind of breaks the pattern. So the other question to ask is, who these stories are going to, and can we bring about a shift? Can we export it somewhere else? So one thing is being repetitive about the kind of stories. The other thing is being repetitive about is the communities or your target audience. So if you just play around with these two frames or these two planes, our life will be too short.
Shreyas, I think you had a question, if you'd like to ask that.
So the second question got answered. So the first one is more so like I would like to write a lot more, but I don't. I do a lot of social. I'm on the field as well, and I see a lot of inspiring stories as well. But I'm not sure. At times, I question my own writing skills, or you know, about the story skill, and there's some kind of inertia that's there. So I'm not sure how, you know, you break that inertia to write. In the same way, there's some report that I'm able to do, but not the stories. You know, that's something that I was thinking of, how to break that inertia.
Oh, and Shreyas, and it's a very common thing. Like, I struggle with it almost every day. So it's not a unique problem. I think writing is the last thing I do. If you look at a story or anything that I share, writing would be like 5% of the time. 95% of the time, I'm visualizing and imagining it. I'm like dreaming with detail, you know. I'm not leaving anything out. In my mind, I'm just telling the story. And it comes to a point where I'm so restless that I have to outpour it. And once I hit that point, only then I kind of try to write it or script it or whatever format. So I always hold myself back until that point of absolute restlessness, when I have nothing, when I cannot do anything else but to tell it or to share it. So a lot of time we sit in front of a screen or, you know, say, okay, let's do this. But then I find that a very corrupted relationship. It's a very polluted relationship with telling stories. To get to an absolute purity of it, I think what has worked for me is I've waited for this point of restlessness, beyond which I have to tell it. So then it's just an outpouring, nothing required. You just need perhaps a grammar check or something, and you are done. And also, the other thing is, it also helps you protect your tonality and your voice. And it is important because if you keep looking at what works for others, then we start fine tuning our work accordingly. And again, that's not something that helps build your voice.
Manjula, I think you have a question. If you'd just like to.
Yeah, I would love to hear this from real people. Okay.
Hello.
Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
this is Manjula here. Yeah, our organization is 32 years old organization. So many people know, like we are finding a little bit difficult to raise funds also. So in some other organizations like walk-in donors, like that, many they will get. But for us, we are finding it difficult, and now we have started to tell our stories to corporates and all. That's it. But finally, the result, no, they don't come back again. Maybe can we improve in any storytelling or that?
Manjula,
Your
I can
suggestion.
share broad reflections, but I think anything that I'm saying will be very generic, because again, context is very, very important in everything that we do. So I will just share some generic reflections, and happy to engage with you one-on-one anytime and look at very specifics of your challenges that you're pointing at. I think one thing is when you say your audience, I mean, let's say it's your donors or potential donors, it's important to understand where do they hang out. And a lot of us assume, for example, that they read newspapers, or we assume a lot of things that they do. It also helps to understand where your target audience hangs out. And by hanging out, I mean where they really pick influential content or messaging from. That will give you a sense of platform and understand if you are going to the right places or not. The second thing is there a continuity in your stories? Some of the things that we have been discussing earlier today is, do you have a narrative mission? Is there a certain kind of change in perception when it comes to migrant communities that you want to bring about? What is that change? And once you identify that, then you should look at a series of stories that are woven together like a journey. So you need to say, okay, for the next 3 months, I'm going to do this every week. So that sense of continuity brings a lot of value, because it's like a iron smith. You're just doing it, tuck tuck tuck. You're going about it in a very patterned way. And I think human beings are pattern seeking animals, and we tend to resonate with patterns, whether it's in nature or in society or everywhere around us. So identifying those patterns that you can fulfill on an ongoing basis, and have those 3 months, 6 months, 12 months kind of plans, learning more about where does your target audience hang out. Sometimes I have seen print work even in this world, which is crazy. Some people tend to attach more significance to print. Some people, so I think some deeper work on that front may help, but happy to engage with you one-on-one and look at it deeply.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so
Sure,
much.
Manjula.
Shweta, if you want to go ahead and ask.
Sure. Hi, Pankaj.
Hi.
My question's coming mainly from capturing stories on videos, because a lot of our audience also are, mothers from rural areas who may have not had formal schooling experiences. And I think videos speak much more than, like you said, stories in text. So we have this challenge all the time where when we generally speak to them, what they do comes out so beautifully, but the minute the camera is front of them, they are shy, and then the words are not coming out, right? So how do you end up, probably more going towards more of technical ways of capturing videos, but how do you get them to tell their stories and slowly come out of that, and how do you as a person capturing that story make them feel more comfortable or contribute to them getting comfortable? Because this is a challenge we tend to face very often, and then we ask them to think of what they would like to say and all of that, and not put a script in front of them. So how do you deal with situations like that?
No, it's a very valid question, Shweta, and I've tackled this in my career and I keep tackling it. So few learnings that have come out for me, I'll share. And of course, as always, happy to learn more specifically and engage. Look, I think capturing something in video, audio is beyond just technicality of it.
Mm.
And again, just the way I said, conversation first, let stories be byproducts of that conversation. In the same way, you create these bonds with people who you are talking about, to a point where it doesn't matter in what setting they're talking with you. Do you have that chemistry with them? And I think, and I have seen this work the other way, where people would just, they will say, okay, I have a great grassroots story to capture. And in fact, a few months ago, I was in Chhattisgarh and I watched exactly what you are saying in action. It came to a point where they had to coach for a day these people to appear in front of camera. And I found it mindless. I found it something which doesn't fulfill the purpose of it. So the spontaneity gets lost, which is why I feel you don't approach them as, okay, let us shoot this, but take it to a point where it doesn't matter. When you are having a conversation with them, it creates a space where none of these interventions will have will affect them in this way. And also toning it down a little always helps. Some of the simple things, like find out if it's a mic, can you use it more subtly? And so there are equipments, for example, that are not out in your face kind of equipment. So on one hand, you look at those things, but most important thing is your own chemistry and bond with these people, because once it's there, then it's a rocket ship or whatever, it doesn't matter to them. They're spontaneous.
I think you're right. I'm right in many ways. And I feel sometimes that putting people in front of the camera and expecting them to say certain things versus just capturing the whole thing as if it is a conversation between two people. I think that also just makes it more comfortable. So one is the person's not feeling that the camera is on their face, but you're still able to capture the same impact and the same story that they wish to say, because you're capturing the entire conversation, not just posing the question and telling them to this. And while you're saying, I'm thinking about it, and I feel that the impact would still be the same. It doesn't matter if you show it like a conversation or you show it like somebody. So yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks, Pankaj.
No, anytime, Shweta. And just one more thing is, I feel sound is highly underrated. And I'm saying that because, so we have this obsession with visuals, which is understandable. But our relationship with sound is equally deep, or deeper, I would say. So in many of these stories, sometimes you can bring the sound of your work or sound of the field. And it's fascinating how sounds characterize a place, a person's work, and so on. So when you struggle with this visual or video, you can even weave in the sound that kind of characterizes a field of work or a person or a place. And I found them to be equally impactful. In fact, I encourage you to record sounds of your work and see what happens. And each of those sound clips you can caption. So I think using sound a lot more than what we do currently is also a good solution.
Thank you, Pankaj. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I think we have a request from someone asking if you can explain the elements of narrative building and origin story quickly again.
Elements of narrative building.
Yeah.
Okay. Look, so I think before that, we have to understand three things, like I mentioned. One is the frame, which is the context. Then there are stories, and then there are narratives. So a good way of looking at narrative is a series of stories woven together as part of a particular narrative. So for example, we were talking about migrant communities, for example, right? Now, within that, if you identify a series of stories that become narrative is, stories are told, but narratives are understood. And these are two different things. Narratives are understood because a series of stories are told continuously in, one after another to form a narrative. And frame, the first one is frame because it's context. It is the social, cultural, emotional context, the field in which you are telling the story. After that, story, and then narrative. Narrative is nothing but a collection of stories. What is the second one?
About how to build the origin story.
Okay, no, so that I had mentioned a bunch of questions that always help form an origin story. And the first, I mean, it's like getting to know a person. There's no difference between getting to know a person or an organization. In many times, in fact, the organization behavior too is similar to the way a person behaves. So who are you? How did you get here? Who do you exist for? And why do you exist at all? What do you do exactly, which is a lot of sense making, and where do you go from here, which kind of brings a forward lens to it. So origin stories, I feel, are a very essential launchpad for whatever you want to do with stories and narratives.
Thanks, Pankaj. Anyone else would want to ask any questions? Please unmute and ask if you'd. Okay. I think then we can start to wrap up here. This is also the launch of the 100 Bachpan Manao stories, and more workshops and more smaller group storytelling, story building workshops, and a journey together, which we'd love for you to be a part of. I would just be adding in a form right now in the chat, and we'd love to hear from you how you can bring in the stories and contribute to the Bachpan Manao 100 stories. We'd love to hear stories from the ground, and amplify the voices that you hear, the stories that you hear every day. Anyone else? Anything else you'd like to add?
Hi, this is Deepika. I just had a couple of points I thought I could make, and a request for Pankaj, actually. Yeah. The intent of this was to really launch the idea of 100 stories of Bachpan Manao, all of you who are part of this ecosystem, to actually celebrate and amplify all the work that's coming from the ground. The way that we will go forward is Maitri has shared a form on chat. Maitri, if you can share the form on chat, please. Yeah. Take a minute to look at it and fill it up. What we will do over the next few weeks is request you to submit your stories of change makers, something that has touched you, an idea which has meant something to you, a person who has made a change on the ground. It could be a field worker, it could be an Anganwadi worker, it could be a teacher, it could be a librarian, it could be a parent, it could be anyone who is doing something which is shifting something in their environment. And what Pankaj is actually offering through this whole experience is to convert that into stories that can build towards the larger narrative of celebrating childhood and bringing attention to the early years. That is the overall intent of this project. So in some ways, this was an introduction to the idea of storytelling, that all of us need some basic frameworks that we can use, which Pankaj has shared. But to then use that perhaps and send back stories which can be refined and made better using his help, so that we can amplify those stories in the context of Bachpan Manao and the early years, which is the reason why we're all here. So this is really an open invitation for y'all to submit stories, which can be part of the 100 stories of Bachpan Manao. Yeah. And we'll work with you over a period of the next several weeks to kind of refine it and make it better and retell them if possible. Pankaj, I have a question for you. Is there a story that you want to leave? I know we are sort of towards the end of the session. Is there a story that you want to leave the audience with that has sort of been something that has inspired you, or something that you actually would like people to read, or something that gives gives a sense of, oh, this is a great way to tell a fairly common story?
There's so many of them, and that's what makes it worth living. I think I really enjoyed, for example, what Shweta did with Anganwadi workers, and I kind of rewrote it, focused on Sunita, who is an Anganwadi worker there in Chhatarpur. But so one of the most complex topics, for example, I have always found is the subject of death in entrepreneurship. And a few years ago, I spent like a week with a family of a founder who was dead. And so that story, which was called Death of a Startup Founder, really helped me understand the human, bonds at play. And in that, it kind of reinforced everything for me. That end of the day, it is about human emotions, not even enterprise. So that definitely is something I have found work in many of great stories that work. So picking that emotional connect can be anything, from life to death to pain to joy, but telling it mindfully and telling it the way it travels to create a bond has always worked for me.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Pankaj, for sharing that. If you can all take a minute to fill up the form. Thanks for joining in. We'd like to see you. Sorry, did someone have a question?
No, sorry, can I? Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. We'd like most organizations here, if not all, to submit at least one story into the form, whatever format it is. And sometimes even it's okay to do it in different languages. Hindi and English would be great, because then Pankaj can help. If it's in other languages, we might have to translate something for him. But please go ahead and do so. And the intent really is to create the narrative for the early years. So therefore, bringing stories from across the ecosystem to help construct that narrative would make the whole thing very powerful. So kindly do so.
Yeah. Great. Thank you all for joining in. We hope this was a useful session, and we will be in touch for the stories and on certain problem statements that you'd like to work on, or what challenges you face while telling these stories from the ground. All right. Thank you all.